Bruce, you must have something really good too.
Of course I do. It's Bruce Danielson, and I guess I'm here to entertain you too.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Operations Committee meeting of Tuesday, November 29th. I'll note that we have all of our members present, so welcome. The first or second item is approval of the minutes. Can I have a motion to approve the minutes of June 22nd?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. I'd do a voice vote here. All in favor say yes.
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 All opposed say nay. Okay, it passes. Now we're going to go on to our third topics. We have Mr. Jim David going first. Update to the travel policy. Jim.
Good afternoon, Operations Committee. For your consideration is a minor amendment to the City Council's travel policy. The current language in red prevents the Council's hourly employees from receiving mileage reimbursement for work-related duties such as picking up supplies and food. This section was amended by Council in 2017 to promote the use of city fleet vehicles for Council and staff travel. The proposed change continues to discourage personal vehicles for travel, but would not prevent the Council's employees from receiving mileage reimbursement, which would mirror administration employees. I would just ask for the committees, just for a motion to recommend approval to the City Council. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what total are we looking at? By adding this, how much more expenses are we going to have?
It's going to be pretty minimal. If you look at just travel to Hy-Vee on 3 nights out of the week, I would think it would be probably under $200 probably annually.
Thank you.
So,
can we get a consensus on moving this forward to the council?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Yes. If you need a motion, we can make it.
No, I think we're good. We'll move it on. Well, we'll take a motion.
Recommend sending this to the city council.
Second, Cole.
Okay, we have that recommendation. We'll have a voice vote on it. All in favor say yes.
Yes.
All opposed, same sign. Okay, that passes. So now next we'll discuss the policies and procedures manual. I've asked the staff to give us an overview of the current manual, after which I'd like for us to discuss its contents and then have us collectively give staff guidance on possible revisions that there may be. This is really the first, I believe, of a 2-part meeting. Today we'll discuss the possible changes, and next time in 3 months or so, towards maybe the end of February, we'll reconvene and have the staff present their recommendations at that time. And we'll get those out and work with staff in conjunction. I think this document is really important to us as a council, not only because it provides us with the baseline expectations for how we operate as a body, but it also provides the public with greater understanding of how the council functions. And I think they want that, and I think we deserve that as well. With that, I'll turn it over to staff, and we can start from there.
All right, thanks, Committee Chair Jensen. Myself, Jim David, and Dave Bixler will kind of tag team on this presentation. And what you're going to see from us over the next few minutes here is just we're going to walk you through each section of the policy manual, not in great detail, but just kind of as a review. And as Chair Jensen mentioned, it'll then be turned over to you all for some discussion. So basically, this is what we'll cover today. It's more of a, what I want to illustrate here is, number one, we do have a policy and procedures manual. There's been one for some time. It's found online. It's available to the public. And it's generally broken down in the way that you see it here. The meeting policies, there's a few more subsets to that. But generally, it looks at meetings, hiring policies, legal services, travel, and Carnegie Town Hall use. And I imagine there's probably some things that you all may want to add or perhaps subtract from this. Okay, so first, and I had the page references up here, meeting policies in general. These are the items that I'll cover on the next few slides here, so I'll just move right into it. There is a policy on seating order. And kind of before I go further, I just want to mention that a lot of the stuff that you see in here is generally a supplement to what's found in ordinance. So in ordinance, Chapter 30 specifically, it identifies a lot of the procedures that the council is bound to follow as the state law. But this further refines them kind of in a more manageable, consumable product that really helps fine tune a lot of the details that you deal with every week. Okay, so seating and voting order. Basically, seating's designated by the chair and the vice chair after the leadership election, which is the third Tuesday in May. It's generally the start of terms or the third Tuesday in May of odd years. They set it, and the way the policy reads is it's set for the next 6 to 12 months. So as you saw recently, it can change periodically. It also designates the seats, the actual locations where the chair and the vice chair sit. So where Chair Sale is, Council Chair Sale is sitting right now, obviously is where the chair sits, and then the vice chair is seated to his right. The other thing that this particular section does is it requires the rotation of the roll call. So you'll notice every week there's a new first person on the roll call. Generally, per Robert's rules and other manuals, it's just done by alphabetical order, but a decision was made years ago to rotate it. So that kind of bit, and that's for the city council meetings at 6 p.m. For special and joint meetings, it was decided a few years ago and put in this policy that the roll call would remain the same as it was for the regular city council meeting immediately preceding that special and or joint meeting. Okay, remote attendance. So the policy does provide for remote telephonic video conference attendance by council members for certain reasons. And as you know, during COVID, we did sort of expand this to the point where we had a few counselors home each night. That changed fairly quickly, but we still do have this option out there. But I will say that this is probably something that we do need to look, I would recommend looking a little closer at, not necessarily changing the policy, but maybe the approach to it or re-energizing it. Because in the past, the reasons listed here, personal illness, emergency, military service, or geographical distance, i.e. on vacation in a different state or something like that, have been the reasons for remote attendance. It might be worth everyone's while to kind of relook at that and just reinforce that as the standard going forward. I'm not suggesting it's been, that it's been abused, but as you know, each week with the invite I send you, there's always a video conference or a teleconference number on it. I think it would probably be wise if we got to the point where it was more deliberate each week. If somebody actually does need it, then we provide it. So remote attendance is noted at the start of the council meetings. That's per the policy. So the mayor will identify and will know through the roll call whether somebody's attending remotely. And that's also noted in the minutes, okay? So moving on here, the other components to it are some restrictions on participating remotely. In other words, there are certain things that council members need to do to make it a valid remote attendance, and some of this is tied into state law as well. So first, the member has to notify the chair in the city clerk's office. The chair, presumably as a matter of courtesy, in the clerk's office so that we can make sure there's a number available for somebody to call in and to get things set up here. We got to make sure that there's sufficient quality of sound. There's been great improvements made in this over the last several years. I don't think that's been a problem, but the bottom line is if you can't communicate with the person on the phone, then it can't occur. Continuous communication unless technical difficulties arise, and that's kind of tied into the next bullet there. Basically, the person has to be on the line the entire time. We have had some cases where somebody will accidentally hang up on themselves or otherwise be disconnected, and usually you'll hear when they beep back in. And the last thing is that members retain their right to speak. Just as if they were here, it might be a little ungainly at times, just because of the time delay, but they have the ability to speak, make motions, and of course vote. Okay, the next item here covered in the manual are changes to city council meeting dates and times. So it's been a policy of the council to provide a great deal of consistency to the public in terms of when they conduct their meetings. So within this vein, obviously the meeting dates are set by city ordinance for city council meetings and informational meetings in particular. Joint meetings generally by agreement. However, there are occasions where the time and date or even location, although that's occurred more seldom, need to change. And in those cases, the council can by resolution change those dates. But the policy set forth a couple of years ago in this manual was more of a goal to have at least a 2-month lead time, and that's primarily related to planning commission items, because they do notice all of those items, and it kind of puts them behind the power curve and requires a lot of extra noticing and extra work, particularly for applicants, if we do it within that window. And we've done a good job at doing that. And then staff, we generally try to keep the council apprised of any potential conflicts coming up. And so I noted up here a few things that we typically always change council meetings for. Municipal Day at the legislature, we have that coming up this February, but it's every February, usually the first Tuesday. The city election and runoff, we change those regardless, even whether there's a runoff or not, because we do it ahead of time. And then the chamber annual meeting is usually the third Tuesday in October. I don't necessarily think there's much that needs to be changed with this. However, just with recent experience and coming to mind, possibly looking at adding the general election to this, because I think there's a lot of interest in it, obviously, and people may be distracted or otherwise not be able to be here. But what I would recommend on this is that we list within the manual those typical dates that we do normally change, not so that it's binding on the council, but just kind of as a heads up to people that, hey, if we're going to change during a year, these are typically when we change. Okay, agenda deadlines and submission of documents also covered in the policy manual, because there's nothing that states what the requirement is for the council in terms of submitting items other than the fact that it needs to have 2 sponsors and submit it to the clerk's office in its final form. What this does, it establishes the same deadlines that the administration is held to, that the mayor's executive order establishes with them. And basically what we look for in my office is to have agenda items the week prior to a meeting by 2 p.m. on Tuesday. That gives us enough time to get things together, avoids any confusion, and allows us to put it on the agenda for you. The other thing it mentions in here is just that applicable staff will prepare the agenda approval forms for you all. You, of course, are welcome to do it yourself, but we're more than happy to do it for you. Okay, contracts and agreements memorandum. This was put in within the last year and a half, I think. Basically what it says is that, you all know that you're able to pull any item from the consent agenda, place it on the regular agenda for discussion and vote. Among these things are the contracts and agreements memoranda that you see nearly every single week. What this policy here says is within 24 hours of the administration providing that contracts agreements memorandum, a council member, if they would like to have staff from the administration here to discuss it during the item, will notify the budget analyst within 24 hours. And subsequently, the budget analyst will apprise the council and the applicable administration folks about the item that's being pulled. It also notes that any questions related to a contract or agreement should be routed through the budget analyst. And the intent of this was just to provide a little more continuity in terms of not how questions are answered, but to better manage them and to not ping certain administration officials more than once if councilors have the same questions. All right, public input. This generally restates to a large degree what's found in city ordinance, but it also provides for the procedures for public input at special meetings. So for special meetings, it indicates that public input will be taken after an agenda item after a presentation is made. And it also goes on to explain there are certain occasions where public input, as required by state law, is not required, and that's within state law. State law says that for certain things like annual reports, ceremonies, public input's not required. It does require public comment at each city council budget hearing, informational committee, task force, joint, and working session meeting, which we do. The other thing is that it provides the amount of time at these particular meetings, and at each one of those meetings, each speaker is allowed up to 5 minutes to speak on any agenda item, with a minimum of 15 minutes afforded to them. So that's why you generally see Council Chair Sale or previous chairs telling us we need to kind of get wrapped up by 5:15 or a certain time to allow for public comment. It also allows the chair to limit the number of speakers during any agenda item after 1 hour of testimony. This is applicable to city council meetings as well, although to my knowledge, I haven't seen it exercised, I don't think, since I've been here, but that option is out there and it's in our policy manual. And then lastly, it provides guidance on the use of electronic presentations. So as you know, electronic presentations generally aren't allowed for the general public comment period, but on items up for final consideration, they are. So we have internal procedures to manage that and assist the public with getting those up. Okay. The last item for me is just council meeting agendas. We talked about this a relatively short time ago and have since implemented it. Hopefully you find it useful. This has basically annotated our agenda to provide descriptions of each agenda business class. It memorializes the fact that we had the Planning Commission recommendation and vote. It provides for the second reading or hearing recommended date. And it also includes that background and objective statement. The last thing that it does is it ensures that any motions that are offered for consideration by the council be put under hearings and resolutions opposed to new business like we've done in the past. So barring any questions, I will turn it over to Jim.
Okay, we'll take questions at the end, maybe. Jim?
City Council's hiring policy lays out a process to fill an appointed position that becomes open. The chair with supervisory oversight constitutes an ad hoc hiring committee tasked with recommending a candidate or candidates to the full council. The committee would include counselors from operations or audit depending on the position. Job postings, applicant screenings would be done by human resources. Once a candidate is identified by the committee, other counselors will have an opportunity to interview the preferred candidate. This process is finalized when an employee is formally appointed at a regular meeting of the City Council by motion. This is the council's non-discrimination and anti-harassment statement. It's modeled after Executive Order 176. It leads with an opening sentence, quote, "It is the policy of the City Council to provide a workplace free of harassment and unlawful discrimination within the City Council office," unquote. The council included this brief statement in its policy manual starting back in 2019. The policy on securing outside legal services was adopted almost 10 years ago and provides a basic framework for when outside legal services may be necessary and how it's approved. The policy states that the $12,000 annual budget for outside legal services is intended for specialized or complex matters that cannot be performed in-house and must be approved by the majority of the City Council. And I'll turn it over to Dave.
Thank you, Jim. Dave, welcome.
Thank you. City Council travel policy, it's applicable to the Sioux Falls City Councilors, the budget analysts, Chief of Legislation and Policy, the City Clerk, the Assistant City Clerks, Internal Audit Manager, and the Internal Auditors. Budget presentation, the budget analysts will budget recurring City Council travel expenses for the South Dakota Municipal League, the National League of Cities, and Sioux Falls Area Chamber of Commerce events. City Council members and staff should submit expected non-recurring travel expenses for the upcoming fiscal year prior to June 30th to the budget analysts. Travel request form. Travel request form is required for travel outside the city limits only if there is going to be an expense incurred. And this form is managed by the budget analyst and is the initial step prior to travel. Pre-authorized travel is travel request forms are signed by the council chair unless the chair refers the decision to the city council during a regular meeting. Pre-authorized travel includes events, trainings, conferences, and meetings of the state of South Dakota or any organization of which the city is a member or has an existing contract or agreement. Pre-authorized travel may also include ground travel within a 350-mile radius of the city of Sioux Falls that relates to the city council's policy-making role. Travel arrangements. The budget analyst and the city council's designated travel coordinator will make arrangements for city council's travel. Travel card uses. The city travel card is to be used for expenses associated with authorized travel except meals. And receipts must be obtained for any credit card charges on the city card. Expense reimbursements are reimbursed per diem rates either within the city or within the state or outside of the state. And that is determined by the administration. And the travel reimbursement forms, upon completion of the travel, the city council travelers will work with the budget analyst to prepare the reimbursement form. The travel reimbursement form must be filed within 30 days from the return date of travel, and the traveler must sign the reimbursement form before submittal.
Thank you, Dave. Tom, welcome back.
So I'll just wrap up here with the Carnegie Town Hall use policy. So we do allow other public agencies and government entities to use Carnegie Town Hall, and they have over the last several years. We've had a couple congressional committee meetings in here, a couple legislative audit committee meetings in here, some Board of Education meetings, and certainly the county uses it every now and then if they need to. So what this does is it establishes the policy, provides some information regarding what's available in here, but we also require people to actually fill out a form and reserve it, and hold them accountable for anything that could happen in here in terms of the equipment, et cetera. It hasn't been a problem, and it's been a fairly straightforward process, but I will say that the priority for any scheduling obviously always goes to city requirements, and generally we ask that it be done between 8:30 and 4:30 p.m., but we do make exceptions in those cases. We'll always make sure that there's a staff member here to assist and be in the building to ensure it gets locked up. The policy allows for the use of microphones, the computer and projection equipment in here, but not the broadcasting or webcasting equipment that we have, because that requires a lot more resources and usually changes to our hardware configuration. So there's no fee for the use under this policy for these organizations to use the facility, but I do want to point out it's not to be confused with City Ordinance 30.027, which does provide for a fee for the use of Carnegie Town Hall. It's $150, and that's generally for anybody who requests what amounts to a special meeting, and we've had one of those in the last couple of years where we invoice somebody $150 to cover the costs. Okay, so at this point, I think, Chair Jensen, we turn it over to you. I'll just summarize by talking to you again about the overall manual. What I think it does is it generally is broken down into meetings, personnel, and administration. A lot of different subsets to that. I think at this point you'll talk about possible additions, deletions, changes, and then hopefully as we wrap up here, some guidance to staff, and we'll come back to you in a couple months.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Committee, I don't know how I want to do this, and I'll leave it up to you. I do know Councilor McCurris would also like to address us, and I think it has some tie-in to what we just went over. So if there's no objection, go ahead.
I'd like just to make some statements on the presentation.
Okay.
And a couple of things have come that, about the remote attendance in the past couple of years when Councilor Neitzer was chair and then now as I was chair, as we've gone through COVID, we adopted kind of a outside of this guideline rule that the council went and adopted as far as the participants in attendance to keep the spaces down to the 6-foot rule when we were going through COVID. So that is probably what you saw prior to that if you weren't on the council, that we did that. And so we kind of made that on the fly during that. So that's not reflected in here, I will say. And another thing that I would like to compliment the staff on a few of the changes that we've made. The travel policy's been updated prior to this, so we made some addendums to that. We also have the annotated, the new council, the way we follow the forums and it's put out to the public was a great idea, and I'm really glad that that's happened. So what we see in our policy manual is a living, breathing document that we try and use as closely as possible. We have gone, for the new council members, It's nice to change chairs every 6 months so you get to know somebody a little bit better. There have been times we've waived that when we had a council that was probably pretty senior and knew each other very well. So we've done that, we've not done that. But that's something I think is being stuck in this chair sometimes. I don't get to have the interaction with the other council members that maybe everybody else does. But this is the best side to sit on because you're close to the coffee and the water, in case you wanted to know. So I just wanted to make those general observations, and I have just a few questions. I don't see any place in here an organizational chart. And now, where would somebody from the outside find the organizational chart for the city council and staff?
The location of the organizational chart right now is an executive order. And that is a possibility to add this to this document. We've had internal discussions on not only an organizational chart, but maybe including job descriptions, just to educate counselors on what each of us do, the different duties. But yeah, right now, the organizational chart is an executive order, and executive orders are not, they're available hard copy, but they're not available online to the public.
So it's a secondary question on that. So we talk about the hiring policy in here. What is the procedure for declaring a vacancy?
That is not stipulated in the policy manual. So what has happened in the past is the chair of the committee that has supervisory authority basically makes that announcement informally and begins a process with HR into getting that position advertised and also appointing that committee. And I should add, if there's not enough members from that supervisory committee, the chair can go outside of that committee and appoint other counselors to it. So yeah, I hope.
Thank you. My last question, Dave, what do we normally spend for a city attorney in, let's go back 4 years for us, for outside attorneys? And how often have we done that?
There's only been 1 year that any of the funds were used, and that was about $5,000. Otherwise, we have not touched it. It's sat there each year, $12,000.
Thank you.
All right, are there any other comments, questions? Go ahead, Counselor Cole.
Thank you. I just have a couple of questions. Tom, has there ever been a stipulation for remote attendance in case of weather? And I know this is very rare, but say we have a snowstorm and it's difficult for a counselor or the mayor to get to a meeting.
I think that it would generally fall under the emergency stipulation.
Okay.
It hasn't really been contemplated because I don't think we've confronted it all too often, but I think that's a possibility.
Okay. Also, another question for public input. When people bring items to the podium, is there anything in our policy regarding presentation of those items or what can and cannot be brought?
There's nothing in the policy that addresses that. In other policies that I've seen, they refer to them as props or whatever the case may be. We don't have anything in our particular policy. We of course have a decorum portion of our ordinance that doesn't necessarily address props either. In the past, we used to have a glass cover on this podium. There was a computer under it for all intents and purposes, and we did ask people to keep things off of this. Now there's a lot of space for people to put things. It generally stays up here after the comments are made. It might be something the council wants to look at, but right now we don't have any policy on it.
And then my last question is regarding the hiring process. The committee chair, this hiring committee, how many are on the committee in general?
2 committees would be operations. There's 4 members of the operations committee. And then the audit committee, there's 7. There's 4 counselors and 3 private members.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Any other questions, Counselor Neitzer?
Yeah. I guess questions and or comments. One thing was regarding the seating order. I think it is good to mix it up. One thing that's been interesting is I think as long as I've been here, this seat has been the outgoing chair. If there is one, sometimes a chair term limits out and isn't in office. Has there ever been any discussion about codifying that part? It's kind of, I mean, it's for like for the next year to be here. I think it's kind of like a seat of honor, and we've always done it.
I mean, just my opinion is we might as well, because that has been the, sort of the custom, is to put the immediate past chair. That's just, it's not in there right now, so that's something we can draft.
Okay, I would suggest that as potentially something, we've done it as long as I've been here. But,
Second.
okay.
That's great.
Right.
Remote meeting attendance, to what Councilor Sale had mentioned, totally agree. We had to obviously, deal with COVID a little bit, so we had to ad lib a little bit. But do you have any suggestions in that regard, or just that because I think there's obviously we learned from COVID, there's going to be some edge cases where there's going to have to be somebody remote. I get that. But I think there's a huge value in being present. So I think, and it might be, I think it's still written in that way, but obviously if anything, if there's any way to do it, you should try to be present. I mean, you're here, you see the citizens, they see you interact with your counselors. So we wouldn't want something where you get into where people are just calling in every week because they just don't feel like driving down here. But in any event, I guess I'm just curious if you think that there should be any changes in light of COVID,
No, I don't
or
think
that
there
we're
should be
okay?
changes. I think just kind of a reiteration of the remote meeting attendance, because we really haven't done that. We haven't said we're kind of off that mode, and it really is, it's available every week to the council members, and certainly not everybody does it all the time, but just to kind of reinforce what you just said, the in-person attendance is usually desired. Of course, things are going to come up, be it weather or illness or things like that.
Okay, and I'm just looking to see if there was, so as far as our travel policy, we've had this come up, this was years ago, but we've had it come up where there's sometimes, there's a city council travel policy, and then there's the administration. They have an executive order or a policy or something like that. Have we ever thought about putting a sentence in or something that says, where these two conflict, this will govern, or this is, we have had a few cases where people have looked at the administration one on Insight, and then there's a conflict where we say certain things about what you're supposed to do in terms of flights or something, and then there's another. They're not in harmony. They're almost exactly the same, but there's a few differences. Or do you think that's not necessary to say that?
I think it would be more proper for the counselors and the staff to be familiar with the policies, the council's policy, and I don't know if there's any need to state that, the differences. I think that could just add some ambiguity to the situation.
Okay, well, as you know, we have had a case where there was some confusion about whether or not, where there may have been an assertion that, hey, this is what the city travel policy said, therefore this is what I did, or whatever, but our policy said something different, but.
And I will say that instance, it was even beyond what the city's travel policy was.
Okay, very good. And that was years ago, so I don't remember the details, but I think that's all I have for right now. I might have a few other things, but that's it.
Counselor Sale.
Dave, while you're up there, to Councilor Neitzert's point, could you, for us, look to see if there are any differences today after we've updated our policy, and, could then get back to us on, hey, this verbiage is different, this verbiage is different, we overrule here.
Sure.
Just for, so that those things don't happen in the future?
I will have that prepared for their next meeting.
That'd be awesome. And it comes to attendance, I think the city charter says you have to attend 75% of the official meetings, which is the first one of the month. Am I right in that? I think that's what is in the charter. But there isn't but it's only for the first meeting of the month is the official city meeting.
Yeah, and I don't even know if like that attendance, whether or not one could argue whether calling in would be attending or not.
Well,
You know, I mean, it'd be parsing words, I suppose. The thing in the travel policy, and I don't even know if we have it anymore, we did have a preference in terms of you were supposed to fly out of Sioux Falls. I think the council's policy at one point was that we wanted to support the Sioux Falls airport, even if it was cheaper to book it out of Omaha, and there was some other difference too.
If I could speak to the travel policy, the council's travel policy is far more restrictive than the city's policy. If you do recall that there is the authorized travel and the pre-authorized travel, that does not exist in the city's policy. And what the council at the time had wrestled with is how do they approve travel? Is it the operations committee? Is it leadership? And so they set up the structure that if you travel, and I don't recall the radius, but it was recently amended, I think within 300 miles, you don't need to go in front of the council. It can just get the chair approval. There's the other provision, I think Councilor Neister did reference, that the council at the time wanted to support our local airport. And so it said, when you do fly out, you're going to fly out of the Sioux Falls Regional Airport. You're not going to go to Omaha. You're not going to go to Minneapolis. And so there were some of these added provisions that the council set for itself and its employees. And so there are differences, but the pre-authorized and the authorized is probably the most significant difference with the city's travel policy compared to the council's.
And thank you. It's not even so much for counselors. It's just so any new employees coming in that work on the council, you know, it's a little fuzzy because obviously you're city employees, but you're council employees. So if there's executive orders that are issued or memorandums that come out, just so every new employee that it's very clear somehow that they understand that this is our travel policy. It's not anything else. It's not anything else that's issued. So you don't have a case where somebody looks at some other travel policy on Insight and it says, oh, you don't have to get this authorized, and you know, you just don't want somebody to fall into a trap. That's my only point.
Any other questions at this time? I'm going to call up Counselor McCurris. I want to hear from him, and then I will wrap it up, but I'll leave it for questions for you guys first, and then I'll wrap up with my thoughts. Counselor McCurris.
Thank you, Committee Chair. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you each today and just share some thoughts as you're looking at the policy manual. I've been here for 6 months, so some of this could be seen as rookie understanding, and you might say, hey, if you understand this historical perspective, you'd change your mind, but kind of coming in, it maybe gives you a fresh perspective, and wanted to share that a little bit. And a couple of things why I'm sharing these today is really two reasons. Number one is we currently have a staff opening in the City Council staff, and I think any organization, whenever you have a staff opening, is a really appropriate time to review things and look at the structure moving forward. The second reason why I'm bringing this forward right now is that we're not dealing with any burning fires at the moment. We're not coming to a city council meeting on a Tuesday night and everybody's at each other's throats. We're not all yelling at each other and screaming at each other. And that's a really bad time, in my opinion, to try to fix policy. We want to do things in advance when waters are kind of calm and can have good constructive conversation. So any of the things I'm presenting today are not like, hey, things are on fire. It's more like right now is a really good time to have these conversations when things are not on fire. So there's three things that I would ask the committee to consider as you're looking at the manual and the structural operations of the City Council. The first would ask you to consider a staffing shift for the City Council. From my experience and my perspective and what I've seen, I think it'd be appropriate to make a consideration of changing in position within the audit staff and maybe moving that to more of a operations assistant or executive support for the City Council, really focused on two different areas. Number one, interacting with the citizens of Sioux Falls. I think that's our first responsibility as elected officials, is to respond to things, whether it's a neighbor calling about how long grass is or somebody's walking their cat without a license. I believe having an identified person that really interacts rather than our legislative policy staff member interacting with all of those conversations, I think that would allow our legislative policy staff member to really focus on writing good legislation and policy rather than handling phone calls each day about length of grass, etc. And so second responsibility that I would see is just handling different details of the council office. For example, who's making sure that there's Mountain Dew in the fridge for the councilors that are sitting in the best seats right over here? Or who's making sure that there's supper for Tuesday night? Whatever it means, I think, again, having the appropriate staff member handle handle those details again, so some of our staff can focus in on the areas where they're really talented and gifted and their overall focus. And so I'd ask the committee to consider potentially a staffing shift that I think would strengthen our interaction with the citizenship and would also potential strengthen details and allow our existing staff to really focus on their gifts. The second thing that I'd ask the committee to consider as you're looking at the manual is kind of this idea of memorializing the responsibilities of the chair and the vice chair. This really just comes from me coming in as a rookie, looking at the manual, coming from a lot of different operations on nonprofits. All the nonprofits I've been engaged with or businesses, it's been really clear. Here's the responsibilities, how you work together as a group, and it's not assumed when new leadership comes. I think right now would be a really good time. Start working on it now so that when new leadership is elected in the next couple of years, that those responsibilities are passed down. They're not assumed. As I've talked to other past council members, a lot of them have said like, oh, hey, well, this is how it's been done, or no, this is the way it was done. And it was always just kind of assumed, and I'm afraid that at some point that might not set everybody up for success. And I think to set everybody up for success is to have clear expectations in regards to our responsibilities as individual counselors and leadership as a whole. So I'm not talking 6 pages here, I'm talking 2 or 3 bullet points. These are the agreed upon things that we as a council, these are the ways we'll interact with one another in our different roles. The third thing that I'd ask the council, or the committee to consider is taking advantage of the budget that we have in place for bringing in outside legal counsel. I think right now would be the appropriate time to bring in outside legal counsel, specifically to guide the council and provide clarity on our manual regarding HR procedures. HR is a complicated matter, and as you've already discussed here a little bit, there's a little bit of tension of you're a city staff, but yet you're council staff, and anytime we come into an HR situation, the city's got all of this structure in place, all of this staff in place. The council doesn't necessarily have that infrastructure in place to support that. So I think getting that outside legal perspective of how do we handle HR issues that arise specifically in the way that we're organized right now, I think would be the appropriate time to look at that. The reality is all of us have our day jobs that we're doing full time, and we don't necessarily have the time to get into crossing the T's and dotting the I's on some of these issues and having something set up. We don't know if the next chair or vice chair will have experience owning a business. The next chair or vice chair may have never owned a business or managed people. Is everything really set in place to understand how to do that? And so I would encourage us to consider that outside perspective to guide us through the process. So I would just ask the committee to consider looking at those 3 things: the staffing structure, memorializing responsibilities, and then outside legal counsel specifically for HR. I'm more than willing to give time to help drafting different things, but more than anything, I want to give the committee an opportunity to work on things as well and hear these thoughts and perspectives. So appreciate your time today.
Thank you for your thoughts. Are there any comments, questions on that, or? Go ahead, Councilor Neitzer, Councilor Sale.
Sure. So first one, the staff, talking to the administration, they do the same thing. Whenever they have somebody leave the organization, you don't just go on autopilot. It's always good to relook at things. So I think it's worth looking at that, whether or not it's, there's no magic to the 3 auditors. I'm not saying what the number should be, but it's really a matter of just how many we want. We could always repurpose somebody. So I think that's a valid discussion. I mean, it really comes down to a matter of how many audits you want to get done, and do you have other things that you need to get done in the organization. So 2, 3, I think it's worth a discussion. One thing that would be, there are some audit rules we would need to take a look at, because as far as like the things that we adopt in terms of international audit standards, you are supposed to have an audit manager, so that brings up some questions about, do you have one audit manager and one auditor? But you could deal with that. That's just detail. Exactly what it would look and what the person could look like, I think it'd be worth taking a look at. The second part, the responsibilities of chair and vice chair, having been both, I think it's a good thing to just have what the expectations are, because it has been just kind of passed down. It's just been kind of a, so if you just come onto the council, I mean, you have no real way to know what the responsibilities are. And I don't think that's fair to the chair and the vice chair or the council. And as somebody who's been there are times in which there are things in which since it's not written down, you don't know, like, am I supposed to share this with the council? Am I what am I supposed to do here? And no matter what you do, you might get yourself crossways one way, half the council is okay with it, half isn't. And then it just creates problems. So like, but as he was mentioning, I don't think it needs to be, 17 paragraphs. It could literally be 2 or 3 things. The chair sends out a staff report or whatever it is and does whatever, and the vice chair does this and this and this. The legal counsel, I've advocated for that. I think whatever it would be, somebody, we could talk to HR as well. They have people that they have under contract. I'm sure they could recommend. I think having policies, and again, I don't think it has to be long-winded or anything hugely problematic or lengthy, but as somebody, when I was vice chair, when you run into sometimes sticky personnel issues, that's another one of those deals where you got to make the call, and sometimes it's really tough. There's these sometimes it's a very simple thing, like, can this person flex time, and, they need to take their kid to an appointment or whatever, and you got to make that call. Is it okay for me to make that call? Or if you have a personnel issue, at what point do I need to bring in the rest of the council versus making an administrative decision? If there's something where there might be some sort of an issue, and I need to go to HR to talk to them, at what point do I need to bring the council in and make that, because they're all of our employee, but you also want to protect privacy, and you want to make sure that it's not something, that maybe it's a nothing issue, and so it puts you in a really tough position. So I think trying to get some of that figured out would be a good thing, and this would be, as Rich had talked about, it'd be a good time where there's no emergency. There's no fire. We don't need to get anybody hired tomorrow or anything. And it has been, just maybe in closing, we have our hiring policy, but we don't say a whole lot about how we will handle employees after they're hired. We have a lot of things that have been done really more kind of by tradition, and I think it would be very good for our employees too to have some clear expectations. The other thing I would say is, having been there as vice chair, I'm not a manager. I haven't run a business. I think I did an okay job, but I made mistakes. Whether or not as a vice chair should be the personnel manager, I think that's a worthwhile discussion. We're all very busy, and so it always seemed a little silly to me that I'm not there all week, and then, somebody's asking me if they can leave an hour early or whatever it is, that it might be better to figure out how you could structure things in such a way that there's just a little bit more stability. And then when you have as an employee, I have my boss literally, quote unquote, changing every year, and then, it might keep you a little bit off kilter. And some of us are more present than others, So I don't know that anybody runs for council thinking that I'm going to be, approving time off. I mean, in other organizations, you've got the Carol Mullers of the world and stuff like that, and the day-to-day stuff, I think we have other things that we could be working on. I don't know what the right answer is. I don't have the expertise in that area, but I think looking at it would set everybody up. And it doesn't have to be crazy convoluted, but just having experienced it myself, there are things in which it can be tough to be a chair and a vice chair because honestly, there is no manual for it. And so again, everything you do, there's always things in which you're trying to make a call, and no matter what call you make, somebody's going to think that you're wrong. And then sometimes it creates divisions where you have the rest of the council and then leadership, and it creates these fractures. And it's just not good for relationally as well. So I think all of those are very good suggestions. So I would support taking a look at any of them.
Thank you for those comments. Councilor Sale.
Thank you. Just to go a little bit farther from what Councilor Neitzer says, when you do get onto the council, there's a learning curve that you have to go through. And certainly when you get to vice chair, you realize, geez, I'm approving time off. I've kind of now been in both situations. I think it might be a little bit backward. Maybe that should be the chair's responsibility to maybe do more of the supervision of the staff than the vice chair. When you get to be the vice chair, in my opinion, you then are learning the role of the chair for that time that you serve as vice chair, because you work very closely together. So you're learning, you're working together, but right away when you're elected to vice chair, hey, I got to do some employee evaluations. Well, I've never done them before. And so it's a little bit tricky, I think, that the vice chair is doing the personnel supervision. I believe that's backwards going forward. I really think that we do need exactly what you said. We're not on fire. We are very fortunate today to have competent staff that can fill in the supervisory role, certainly of the audit. So going forward, I do think I agree with you that there might be a retweak of our situations. As far as the mayor approving our organizational chart, I believe we should do that by resolution. And we should set our organizational chart, even though he is the mayor of the city and a member of the city council. We should set our organizational chart by resolution. If we choose to change that, we should have the ability to do that. And so I'm all for us going forward and doing a reevaluation of how we approach this. I think it's a good thing to do. We are very lucky right now to have the city council staff in the middle of some leadership, communication, culture training that I sat in on yesterday. And I'm very, very impressed. And certainly any of this that we're going forward is only going to strengthen us going forward. I believe the council staff has to be the glue that holds the city council together year after year after year after year, crisis after crisis, election after election. It's kind of hard to do because everybody that runs for council has a little bit of an ego, otherwise they want to run. So you come in, you have a little bit of an ego. I think I know what I'm doing, and you really don't. At least, okay, I really didn't know all the things that the council was supposed to do, set policy. Lastly, I'm going to ask Dave Bixler a question about the attorney's budget. Is it loose enough wording there that we don't have to hire an attorney? Could we hire an outside HR professional with that same amount of money?
I think you can do whatever you want with your operations budget. There are funds there that are available. I don't know if there's anything in policy that says you can only use it for legal. That's just where we have it budgeted at.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. So if we go forward to look for an outside professional to come forward, I think we've got to look at a broad spectrum of who could give us the advice we need in that whole area as far as structure, and also HR, dealing with the HR that we have in the city. And they're great, but they also will tell you they don't work for the city council. They work for the administration. So as we've gone in the past, there's been times where they really don't want to give you any advice. And that kind of puts us in a bad position. So I appreciate your input. I look forward to having the discussions on how we can do this forward.
Thank you.
Could I just?
For sure.
Yeah, that was great commentary. I think if you did have, some of that personnel stuff stay under a counselor, I think a chair is an excellent idea. Because when you are a vice chair, you are brand new and you're just learning the ropes, and you may not have been with the council that long at all and still just learning. Whereas if you're chair, presumably you've been vice chair and you've kind of learned the ropes, and it does make it harder as a vice chair. So I would totally support if we went in the direction of keeping it under, of making that flip. And then you could talk about if there's anything that the chair could be relieved of that the vice chair could do if that's an issue. So that would be great to look at. And then I think potentially discussing with HR, they have existing contracts. They get contracts to bring in personnel firms and things like that. So asking them for recommendations would be a good place to start. So I'm sure they've brought people in themselves to help them write manuals or come up with policies. And to your point, I've had that discussion as well, where they. I think we always need to harness them, and sometimes we just have to give them permission to, we want your opinion. You are the experts. I mean, they can be a little gun shy at times because they've been told in the past, hey, this is a council, stay out of your turf. But sometimes we have to make sure, and I've told them, I value your input. I want to know. So we just have to be willing to do that. The only other thing that I wanted to bring up today that I've been kind of thinking about, and I don't know that there's a policy change necessarily, but it's something that has been a bit of an issue. Remember a few years back when we changed the time of the meetings? Councilor Sale had made a mention of, we're just gonna have to make sure we watch and see how this works. The only thing that has given me a little consternation, and I know it's something that, we've had to manage the time between the 4 and the 6. The only concern that I've had is, I sometimes feel like it's more of a rush than anything. And I just don't want to be in the position where we feel like we're pressuring presenters to, I even hear them make comments. I mean, they have to give their time, and if they say 20 minutes, they should be 20 minutes, not an hour. I mean, we have to manage, but I don't want to have anything where people feel like they've been invited to speak and that they're having to rush through, or that we have to cut off questions. And of course, you can ask questions offline, and we do a lot of that, but that's been my only thing is with that 4 and the 6. Sometimes it's really time compressed, and I don't know what the fix to that is. I'm not even saying that I'm suggesting that we change meetings back, but that's been a little bit that we're just under the gun, because it's just not a lot of time when you back in the time that you have to have for public input, and then the reset and everything else. And then it does make it like, if I want to get on the informational, now sometimes I got to get out a month and a half. And so that's been my only bother with the 4 and the 6 o'clock. I think it's worked well for every party, but I'm not sure that it's entirely worked well for the council. I remember in previous years when I wasn't on the council, and then the years I was on the council, the informationals could be a lot more in-depth and a lot more deep conversation, and right now they just feel a little rushed. That's my only other comment. So, and I'm not, it's nobody's fault. It's just, it's a function of what it is, but just something to think about.
Okay, any other comments? You know, I'll add some of mine, and, you know, I've been thinking about this and working on it for some time, and I think the policies and procedures manual will always set us up for success. Like everyone has talked about tonight, people want to understand what they are doing in our role. Staff need to understand what they're doing in their role. And I think the city of Sioux Falls, the citizens of Sioux Falls want to know that as well, or have a resource to go and find what our staff are doing and what we are doing as well. So that I think that this policy manual should always be enhanced, and we can always do better, and that's fine. So we should continue to do that. I have 4 things that I'd kind of like to go over, and I wrote them down so I wouldn't really mess up. But I think also what we should do in this policy manual is put a simple but understandable rundown of the various official meeting types and their frequencies that are out there in some capacity. And we can work through that language and how that's presented. But I kind of want to do that. And tied to this, I'd also like rundown, comprehensive rundown of the various bodies that members are on. For an example, UDC, CCOG, many of the committees that we're on, because I think that also helps for a city councilor understanding, or someone that wants to run for city council understanding that there are other roles. It's not just Tuesday nights for sure, but that helps to put those obligations in any given year out there. Second, and this kind of goes to Kurt's point, it goes to all of our points really as we've talked, but I'd like to include a little bit more about the organization, particularly as it relates to staff, and the fact that this, you know, is a part-time city councilor like many of us talked about. I think to Kurt and Greg and others, some of the time off requests, I think that should be handled via staff and not via city council, and the staff should be able to hold each other accountable with the chair and the vice chair overseeing that supervision. So I'd really kind of like to look at that as a part of this. And then, you know, in the annual pay performance resolution, we include some of it, the various organizational charts, etc. Again, to piggyback on this, but I'd like to, you know, get the job descriptions out there and the administrative support to the council, and how communications to the council should be handled. I think that would be very helpful, because it then helps the city councilors be more effective and impactful for the citizenry. Lastly, to a lot of the points, and specifically McCurris's, when you come in, you're new, you're green. There's nowhere in the policy or process for a new councilor orientation. So I think that this should be defined as a process that covers everything from administrative support to the nuts and bolts of how meetings are run. Why do we do this, that, and the other thing? And I think that that should be encouraged, and I think the staff could bring those ideas and work with me and anyone else that may have interest in that to make that a priority. In terms of revisions, we need to update the public input section so it represents, or so it's representative of our current ordinance. I'd also like for us to identify the recurring events that cause a change to meeting times, kind of as Tom was saying, and you know, without binding the council to any of those changes. And I want to include in that, and I think it was mentioned, but if not, I'd like to include the general election. And any election that falls on a Tuesday, I think it would be appropriate for the council to move its meeting. Not necessarily that it needs to move the meeting, but I think it should, just so that when people get off of work, let's say at 5, 6, they can go vote and they don't have to miss the council if they have some important agenda item that they'd like to talk about. So those are some of the comments that I'd make. I do believe that from a personnel and an HR perspective, we rely on the administrative's HR a little bit, but I think as we refine this policy and procedures manual, we also need to enhance our own horsepower and our own decision making. And to Greg's point, it's when do we do certain things without breaking privacy? How do we do this? And those are the things that I think will strengthen the council as we continue to move forward. So those are some of my comments, and just kind of wanted to get those out on the table. Councilor Neitzer.
You've reminded me of a couple. I think it would be a great idea to put in, you know, the other bodies that we serve on with maybe a short description of what they are, because it would serves the public, because then they know the other things we do. But I think just as if you're thinking of running for council, or you're running for council or elected, to find out these other things that you may serve on, maybe it'd be worthwhile to put in something in there just mentioning that, hey, you know, every March or April, we're also responsible for property tax hearings, however you want to say that, because that's a big surprise to people when they show up and they find you're going to have to give a week to do these property tax appeals. Just as mentioning that it's one of our statutory duties. I mean, it could just be kind of along with that other thing that everybody's a member of that. And as far as, you know, we could take the job descriptions straight from, you know, from HR, and we could incorporate those by reference, or we could put those in there, and if they're changed, we could apply those. And those would be great, because then it's, you know, because you can go find them, but nobody likes to go look in 12 different places. So if I want to just know, hey, what is the you know, what does the operations you know, legislative manager do? Well, there it is, instead of having to go dig it out. And then it has, because that's really their marching orders of exactly what their responsibilities are. So, and then if it's in the manual, the other thing too is that if when we do an annual review, give us a chance to go through their job description and see, like, is it still reflecting what we want them to do, or have they started taking on new things that aren't reflected in there and that need to be updated? Because I don't know that we necessarily systematically go back and look at them, because they just kind of sit out there. I think, you know, the last time I remember we did one was, of course, when we had a vacancy. So we looked at it and we tuned it a little bit before we put it out there. But it wouldn't be you know, if one of our staff is doing 7 more things than they were before, we need to get that updated, and we need to rethink whether or not the pay scales are where they should be, you know, reflecting what their responsibility is. So, and then the orientation, I think that's a great idea. I think staff does an incredible job with our orientation, but maybe having it a little more memorialized to what it's going to cover would be really good. And we do an incredible job, and we have an incredible staff, but making sure that we get some of those things on paper so that, you know, gosh forbid someday when they decide to retire or leave, we've got the stuff in there so that the next person is set up for success. Because we have an incredible amount of talent, and I want to just make sure a lot of that stuff that's up here is on paper too. So, thanks.
Councilor Sale.
I'll just add a little bit more to that. I remember my orientation, it was a blur. Trying to get a whole load of hay, and I was only one cow there to eat it. And when Dave Bixler got to the travel policy, I told him, just put that back in your folder. I'm not even interested. in hearing that right now. It would have been nice for me, just a guidance for the staff, to maybe have a follow-up 2 months in. Okay, now you're 2 months, now you figure out where the coffee machine is. A formal sit down, because your head is spinning when you get on the council. What do you mean UDC, I gotta go to that meeting? What are all these other things that you have to do? I'm wondering if we shouldn't try, maybe informally, put together a job description for a city council member. That here's what you're gonna be expected of when you get on the city council. Maybe informally. Those are the only things I wanted to say, and I trust that the chair will follow up and try and investigate what we can do to bring on an HR professional attorney to try and give us some guidance before however long it takes. I appreciate it.
Right, and I think a part of all of it, it kind of just goes back to, you know, we're an organization. We should have an organizational chart. We should have policies and procedures that set us up for success. And that's what we're really doing here. And to Greg's point, and, you know, everything that we're putting down on this policy and procedures manual is going to be here a lot longer than I am, for sure. And it will be enhanced, it will be changed, and I think that's a great way to do it. So I just direct staff to kind of, you guys have listened, you've heard kind of some consensus on a lot of this stuff. So if you guys would be willing to work with the counselors and then come back to us, you know, sometime in that end of February or 3-month time frame, that'd be grateful. We gratefully appreciate that. So if we're done with our comments and questions, let's just move on to the public comment. Is there anyone from the public who would like to speak on any topics covered today? Councilor McCurris? All right, this meeting is adjourned.